Chapter 2. Even though it had been over 4 years since Robert Marty had wrestled for his prep school, he still liked to think of himself as a wrestler, and that was the thought that crossed Robert's mind as he put himself into a yogic posture. He was sitting with his butt between his ankles and his back lowered down to the ground. Celibate pose, they called it in yoga, and Robert felt himself fully deserving of the position. He had been in Delhi for months now, and it had been a dry season, as his friends at Columbia liked to call it. Robert looked pretty much as he had at college. No punk detour for him, no body piercing or tattoos. He had more of a 60s look about him. Long hair, Pancho Villa mustache, deadhead t-shirt, and a Hopi necklace that Allen Ginsberg, the poet, had given him. "Your uncle and I go way back," Robert remembered Ginsberg telling him, referring to Robert's uncle who had raised him after his own parents had been killed in a car crash. "May you and this necklace have some great experiences together." Robert's thoughts about Ginsberg's gift were cut short by the booming voice of the yoga teacher sitting in front of the class. "Pull up on the lower chakras when you chant Sat. Relax when you chant Nam," called out the turbaned yogi, a man called Baba, who led the class. Baba wasn't the type of yogi Robert thought he would meet in India. He wasn't some scrawny Gandhi-like Indian living on nuts and cow milk. He was Texas-sized, with a neck as wide as Robert's thigh. "Sat," Robert chanted as he contracted his anus, genitals, and navel. "Nam," he chanted as he relaxed them. This exercise had struck Robert as unbelievably personal when he had first tried it. Here he was in Delhi with 30 or so Westerners, tightening their anuses and genitals at the same time. But like so many other things in India, the exotic had quickly become commonplace. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Sweat began to pour from his skin, soaking his shirt with its smiling visage of Jerry Garcia on it. Delhi was hot and humid, but Robert kept up until Baba finally told them to relax deeply on their backs. After their meditation, Baba then said some brief remarks to them. "In the end, you are the only one who can decide who you are," he said. "Mind is your greatest servant, but it must never dictate. Soul must rule, and mind must obey. Otherwise, tragedy will lie ahead. So, if it is the kind will of the God, I will see you next week, okay?" Baba said, dismissing the class. After that, the students began to leave, but Robert stayed. He had been coming to Baba's class for weeks now, but he had never talked directly to the yogi. But today he had resolved to speak to the man. After a few minutes, everyone else had left. Baba glanced over in Robert's direction and crooked his index finger, beckoning him. Robert walked over the grass to the Indian. "What do you want?" Baba asked, as Robert felt the yogi's intense gaze on him. "I want a teacher," Robert stammered. "You know what it means to be a student?" "I'm not sure," Robert replied, feeling lost in Baba's eyes. But before Baba could say anything more, Robert heard voices coming toward them. He glanced over and saw Swami Basunda, the head of the yoga center, coming toward them. To either side of Basunda were his 2 bodyguards, and following behind were 40 or so of his devotees. Baba stood up as Basunda reached them. The old man shook his gold-handled cane at Baba as though he was about to strike him. "I take you in," Basunda began, spitting out his words. "I let you teach, make money, and this is how you repay my courtesy." "I don't need your courtesy," Baba replied. "You piece of shit!" shouted Basunda. "Who the hell do you think you are? You have nothing, no ashram, no students, no money. You are just a useless parasite taking up space. Out of envy, you have tried to poison my students, and for that, you have lost my protection. If we find you still here in the morning, my men will deal with you. So now you have been warned. This is courtesy you have not extended to me." "Cello!" Basunda shouted, waving his hand angrily as he and his whole entourage headed back to the ashram. "What's with him?" Robert asked after a few moments. Baba nodded to himself as he stared at the sun setting, blood red on the horizon. He then turned to Robert. "Come here, son," he said softly, as Robert stood right before him. "You want to be a student?" Baba asked, placing his hand on his shoulder. "Yes." "Meet me at the booking station at Delhi's main rail terminal at 10 tonight." "We're leaving Delhi?" Robert exclaimed, stunned by the turn in events. "When teacher asks, student obeys. When destiny calls, student thanks God that his time has finally come," Baba answered, pressing down hard on Robert's shoulder. "Meet me at 10. We leave for Rishikesh tonight. You have been accepted," Baba added, walking away. That night, Robert arrived at the station with an acute sense of buyer's remorse. He walked by a red-turbaned man sitting on the ground selling dead lizards as aphrodisiacs. Robert glanced down at their shiny white bellies and serrated tails, arranged like daggers on a dark cloth. The vendor gave him a dark, knowing look, but Robert continued on his way to the station. Even at this hour, the enormous facility was crowded. There were young people milling about and families asleep on the floor. Robert grudgingly made his way over to the booking station, wishing he could just forget the whole thing and go back to his cheap lodging. He thought back to the night he had decided to go to India. His 4 years at Columbia were over, and he was having dinner with his Uncle Jack, Jack's newest squeeze, and Allen Ginsberg. For the whole dinner, Robert played aimlessly with his pasta. The two people who had raised him, his Uncle Jack and his Aunt Lourdes, had just finalized their divorce. Then he heard his uncle talking. "Going to Tangiers with you and Burroughs was the best damn thing I ever did," he exclaimed to Ginsberg. "Why?" Robert asked, getting interested in the conversation for the first time. "Because, you see, Robert," Jack said, holding a bottle of wine, "you have to take the cork out," he pulled the cork dramatically out of the bottle, "to get the juice." After dinner was over, Ginsberg took Robert to the side and whispered, "Fuck Tangiers. Go to the Himalayas and be with the yogis. That's the source of it all." Robert had taken Ginsberg's advice, but he had hardly reckoned that would mean he'd be going to Rishikesh with a man he hardly knew. With that thought in mind, he waved to the yogi who was standing at the booking station. As soon as Robert reached him, Baba hoisted a large duffel bag onto his shoulder and began walking toward the gate. On the platform, a crowd had already gathered. Baba maneuvered himself to a spot near the tracks as Robert tried to keep up with him. A few minutes later, a train began making its slow way into the station, as the platform became more and more crowded. When the train's doors finally clanked open, the crowd poured in. Baba grasped Robert by the wrist and pulled him through the crowd, eventually pouncing on a metal bench like it was a game of musical chairs. As the train traveled north, the railway car became less crowded. Eventually, there was no one pressing against Robert's knees, and there was only one person sleeping on the luggage racks above the seats.